All right, so let's get started. All right, we've got this holly berry photo that we're working with today. I'm pulling mine up right now. So I'm getting excited. It's not as cold here as I would like it to be, but I'm glad that it's fall. I'm ready for all of the Halloween and Thanksgiving and Christmas and all these things are coming, and I'm starting to feel the excitement of that. So let's paint today. Everybody should have their colors, their paper taped down, ready to go. And we're going to start. All right, so let's take a look at the photo, and this is something that I always do in all of my classes. Whenever we're starting, I definitely we just talk about a little bit of strategy as we start into this so that everybody kind of has a little bit of an idea where we're going. So there's basically just two colors going on. We got these reds and greens, okay? And then we've got this nice sort of undulating tone going on in the background. So I want to try to capture a little bit of that, and you can see this little sparkly texture that exists here and there. I'm going to emulate that by using some of the salt in the background, and I'll show you how we're going to do that. When we're going to sketch this out, and the only thing that I really want to focus on or talk about is just, the idea of simplifying, okay? I know we've got these little evergreen strands that are in here, and they are very detailed, that type of thing, but again, we're going to focus on simplifying those shapes. And we've got some nice, there's sort of this background, the way that the camera gives us that nice depth of field sort of action. We have some of these leaves that are in the background that are sort of blurred, maybe obscured just a little bit. We want to capture that, okay? And so we'll be doing that with a little bit of wet on wet. And while these other leaves, they're more in the foreground, closer to us, a little bit more in focus. And so we'll make sure to do that in our painting as well. And I think that's about it. One thing I will mention about the berries, there's not a dramatic light coming in, giving us a real sharp contrast. And so the highlights and shadows on the berries are kind of a little bit all over the place. So I'm going to strengthen that by just adding much more shadow on the bottom side of each of the berries, with a light source coming down from the top. Okay, so let's start working through this by getting a sketch going. I'm going to sketch pretty carefully the placement of the berries and these leaves that are right here in the front that are real in focus. The others, I'm just going to kind of give myself a basic little sketch, a little block in, because I'm going to paint those wet on wet so that they're nice and soft. Okay, all right, so let's get started here. I do have a little rectangle I'm working with a landscape orientation here. And so I'm going to start, and just mind watch your scale, because we are working tiny, so it's easy to start coming in here and drawing really big. But if you've got a small sheet, we want to get small here. Stay small, start small, and stay small. So I'm just going to start getting these leaves in here, and I'm just focusing on their outside shapes, really. Not really focusing, I'm not drawing all the veins and all of that. I just want to focus on the shapes. So I'm just going to sketch along here. And while I'm sketching, actually, I'm going to drop the camera down just a little bit, just while I'm sketching, just so that you can see a little bit better what I'm doing here. And for these little branches, the little evergreen little strands, little limbs are coming out, I'm not going to draw each of those little needles, okay, that are on those branches. I'm just going to draw basically just sort of a shape that kind of indicates to me, and I'll do a little strand right down the middle. That just kind of helps me know right where that is, and then I'm going to paint all of those little needles in, but I'm not going to draw them. Some of my leaves are getting cropped off just a little bit because I didn't want this so small that it was kind of floating sort of in the middle. I wanted it to kind of go off the edge just a little. So I told you these little, there's still little stems that kind of go off in the background here. They are blurry, but I am going to give myself just a little bit of a line to kind of indicate where they are, because that's just going to help me to paint those, know where to position those later. And keeping those outlines really soft, because these are going to be blurry in the end. This is a really fun one to do. If you're, I think I was speaking to somebody else in the group, and they had a poinsettia, I think, that they were wanting to work on, and they were definitely going to, I think it was Jill Durham, she was going to be working on this little painting too. And so what I show you, the technique for getting the color into these leaves, it's going to make it a nice transition into some other plant type painting that you might want to do. So I am drawing all the little, one of these berries can be a little bit bigger. I'm drawing all the little tiny stems that lead out to the berries so that I'll know where those are later. And then I'll show you something real quick just so that you know to look for it. So there's a little cluster of leaves back here sort of in the background. They're so blurry. We know that there are leaves back there, but it's kind of hard to tell exactly what's going on. Don't worry about drawing all of that, other than to maybe grab the outside edges of it just for placement. And we're just going to drop color into those areas, okay? So that it's not... I'm going to get my little evergreen, and again, I'm just making little bubble shapes to kind of indicate where those little strands, where those little needles need to live later, but I'm not going to draw all those needles right now. All right. I might put, one of these leaves are right here in the front, I might give a little bit of indication of a vein just with my pencil, but I'm not going to overdo it. Okay, all right, so there's my little sketch. All right, so that didn't take very long, and again, you know, one of the reasons that we want to do these smaller paintings is so that we can do them quickly, efficiently, and we can give them as gifts, okay? All right, so let's start with our background. I'm just wetting, I'm kind of starting with my small brush. I want to control the amount of moisture that's going into my painting, okay? And I can do that by using a little bit smaller brush so that I'm not putting too much out there at one time. All right, so what I want to do is come in here, and I'm actually just wetting pretty much anything that's the white background. I'm just wetting it. I'm kind of going into these, I'm painting over these little needles. I'm not worried about those right now. I'm just painting right over those. And I'm wetting anything in the painting that's that white background sort of color. Not getting into my leaves or the berries, just the background right now. And you want to make sure it's nice and wet. And I definitely hope that everybody's able to use, you know, some good quality watercolor paper. If you don't have good quality watercolor paper for this, just make sure that maybe you do one section at a time, because the paper is not going to want to stay wet for you. It'll just kind of keep drying out really quickly. But the better paper, it'll stay wet like it's supposed to without drying out too quickly. All right, so this is one of those hard things with watercolor when you're painting without any color. It's kind of hard to see where you are, so just tilt your head, tilt your board, whatever you need to do. In fact, I'll show you. You can see where I've gone. I've left, the leaves are dry. I didn't get the berries wet. Anything that was just the white background is what got wet. Including, I did go over these areas where where those little evergreen needles are going to be. Went over those too. Just did that whole thing. All right, so you can see how much moisture. Nice shiny paper. All right, so real quickly, now I'm going to get in here and mix up a sort of a gray, a warm gray tone, and I'm using my ultramarine blue. Okay, not a lot of it. We just need kind of a thin, really light, transparent amount. And then get into your sienna, just a little bit of the sienna. And you can see it's making just this nice gray, okay? And it's kind of a warm gray, and it's warm because I'm adding a little bit more of the sienna. All right, I'm going to add much more water. I want this to be very, very thin, very, very transparent. You can see how thin and watery it is. It's almost, it's very, very transparent, okay? All right, so again, using my small brush because it holds less, and so I can control what's happening. I'm going to come into my background where it's wet, and by using my photo as my reference, I'm going to drop in sort of this darker tone, you know, wherever I see sort of these little shadow undulations happening in the photo. Mostly it's kind of up on the corners a little bit, kind of that little vignette effect. But it is a lot darker down here on the bottom. Just dropping that gray right on that wet on wet, going right over those little areas where the needles are. Okay, so you can see I've added just a little bit of that tone. And they're very light, very pale, very, very thin, transparent. Okay, then I'm just going to take my towel. If you have any water building up on the edge of your tape, go ahead and clear that off. That actually keeps feeding more water back into your painting, and we just want to get rid of that. And the time that it takes to do that kind of lets that paint start to sit for a little bit, move around. Because as you know, watercolor kind of continues to paint itself. After you paint it and you walk away, it'll still kind of keep moving around a little bit. Okay, now I'm going to do some salt now. That little shimmery, I know that there's like a fabric that was used in the background, I guess, for this painting. I'm just going to put some right here in my hand. This is just regular table salt. But that little, all of this little shimmery effect that's down at the bottom, I'm going to emulate that by adding a little bit of the salt right down here at the bottom in these wet areas. And it's okay if it gets into the dry area just a little bit, that's fine. But I'm just going to put that down here, and there's really not any up at the top. I'm not going to worry about it so much down there, but I will keep it down here at the bottom. Okay, all right, and then that's all I'm going to do. Let me hold it up so that you can see. You can see where I sprinkled all that salt in there. Now, as that sits, it's going to continue to react and push around some of the pigment that's already there, and it'll give us a real soft little texture later, okay? I've got a little puddle of water forming over here that I didn't want, so I'm just going to blot that up right quick. All right, so all of this needs to dry so that we can go to the next thing. It just needs to dry a little bit. It doesn't have to be completely dry. I'm just going to go over this with a hairdryer just for a second. Okay. All right, it's not 100% dry, but it's just barely damp, and that's okay. All right, so I'm going to keep going here. I want to work on the leaves that are in the background that are a little bit kind of fuzzy, that were a little bit blurry. So I've dried all this up here, but I'm going to come in here again, and I'm going to, with my small brush, I'm going right back over everything up at the top, in this top area. I'm not paying attention to the leaves that are really in focus, I'm just wetting this area back here where everything is kind of blurry. And I am using a smaller brush just because I want to control how much moisture. I don't want it to be like super, super wet. I do want it to be wet, but not over the top. I just want a nice layer of damp paper back here so that I can do that nice wet on wet effect to get those leaves nice and soft. So if you think about it, what I've done here, I just took my brush and I just wet everything that was up in this corner back here, all of that. And I actually got my screen wet, but all of this is wet, okay? All right, so let's come over here and mix up some green to go in there. I'm gonna start really light, okay? I wanna start with my lighter greens first. So my lighter, brighter greens. So I'm gonna start with my cad yellow. Get a little bit of that out here on my palette. I'm going to get into my ultramarine blue, but just a little, just a tiny little bit. You can see that blue is so dominating. Anytime you're mixing colors, just make sure you start with your lighter color first and then always add that darker one, just little by little, so you don't overtake. All right, then I'm going to come into my painting and I'm just going to start dropping in. I see like this really bright green, the brighter greens that are here. I'm going to put those in. And this is that part, you know, where I'm not really drawing, I'm not really getting too detailed because these shapes are so blurry back here. You can't really tell what part of the leaf you're dealing with. Just go with the color. Don't worry about the actual outlines and shapes. The green starts to darken a little bit, so I'm going to keep adding a little bit more blue, which deepens that green. And see, when I just drop it on that wet paper, it really just takes off and gives me those nice, soft, blurry edges that live out there. This little leaf right here. I do have a real pretty exact shape is presented to me in the photo, so I can see where it is. And I did have a little sketch line earlier. And there's lots of different colors of green in this leaf too, so you know it's kind of yellowish in some spots, so just grab some of your yellow and you can even just drop it in places to give it a little extra. Now it may be bleeding out you know, irregular or in a direction that you didn't necessarily anticipate, and that's okay. We're working wet on wet. But I can tell you, you know, the wetter the paper is, the more bleed you'll have. You know, when you've got time to work on this, you can wet this area, maybe set a timer for like 3 minutes and let it just sit until it's just barely damp, and then come in and do the same effect. But the bleed will be less, okay? You can kind of control it by just watching the clock and letting some of that moisture evaporate out of there. But I'm keeping this pretty loose. I'm just going to keep moving here. That one leaf is a little bit darker green, so it's just these two colors, the cad yellow and the ultramarine. I'm just mixing them in darker and darker quantities. And I'm just letting these colors bleed together. There's some little, you know, there's like another piece of a leaf sticking out over here a little bit, and it's okay. I'm just gonna, I see a dark spot, I'm gonna put a dark spot. Okay. All right. I'm gonna start moving forward into the foreground just a little bit. So again, these same two colors, they just can mix together in infinite varieties to give you all kinds of colors of green. This is on dry paper now. This leaf is, I'm moving more into the foreground where the edges are a little bit more crisp. And let me just make sure, I just realized I'm just peeking back up here right quick to make sure that nobody had a question. I think we're good. Okay. I try to remember to do that as we're going. Sometimes I'll sort of get on a roll and then I forget to check on you. Okay. So I'm just adding some of this it's just sort of a medium tone of green that I'm adding in here for this leaf. But the top of the leaf is a little bit brighter, so I'm just going to grab some more yellow and just make sure that the top of that leaf has got a little bit brighter tone to it. And the edge of this leaf kind of goes into the background just a little bit, kind of touches the background in a couple of places. So if it does that and it kind of bleeds a little bit, that's okay. It's just kind of part of that loose quality. That's one of the things that's so nice, especially when you're trying to do something that's really loose and really quick. And you can even take your towel or paper towel, either one. I can just lift out a little highlight right there on that leaf. I'm going to move over to the other side for just a minute. There's some nice greens in here. If you notice, what I'm trying to be careful to do is to really kind of undulate the color. I don't want everything to be all the same color. I want to keep all these yellow greens and dark greens and bluish greens. I want to keep all of those going because they are in there and they look so nice and they vary so much. So I want to try to capture that so that they don't all just bleed together and look the same. You know, even after I get some paint in here, I can come back and sort of touch some of these areas that are just a little bit darker maybe, just by adding a little bit more color in there. You know, that leaf that's right up front, it's really dark in one spot. I can even take my, you know, the end of my brush, just the handle, and I can kind of make a little indication of some veins very lightly into the paper. What I'm doing here, I'm bruising the paper, just bruising it very, very lightly, and it makes a tiny little line for paint to run into, and it won't do that right away. You have to kind of let it sit for just a second, but it helps you you can sort of draw into the paper just a little bit with some of these things. Okay, this is still wet down here. I'm not going to bother with that right now. I'm going to get some more of this blue out here. I need a little bit darker green. I'm going to kind of come back up. This leaf was a good bit darker. This has dried, or not dried, but it has, it's a little bit less wet than it was earlier, and that needed to be a little bit darker, so I can kind of control where it goes a little bit more. But getting in there to begin with was good to make sure that I was getting the shapes in there that I wanted. All right, I'm going to start working on these leaves that are right here in the front. Again, we're just working with these two same colors, the ultramarine blue and the cad yellow. And you look how many different greens we have. Let me hold it up. So many different greens just with those two colors. So just keep mixing those up, keep those varied. Here's an important thing, just in terms of our composition. This leaf right here, we need to be able to see lots of good contrast between this leaf in front and the one behind. This one's lighter in value, and this one gets really dark right in here. So we want to make sure we do that in our painting so that this leaf is well forward. And this is really wet right here, and we need a nice sharp line. Same thing with this leaf. It's really wet right now. And both of the leaves that are touching each of these wet leaves need to be dry. So let me dry these right quick. Okay. All right, I'll show you a little hairdryer accident that I had, in case you have one too. This is one of those things where it can happen and then you just don't worry about it so much. So this was my leaf, but then I held the board in such a way that when the hairdryer hit it, it blew this paint up into that area. But you know what? I'm going to leave it. I'm not going to bother with it. And I'm just going to let that incorporate into my composition. So you can watch as I paint, and you can see how I kind of treat that in just a little bit, so that it sort of just becomes part of the composition. So sometimes you have these things, and that's why, see, I have Bob Ross with me always, okay? He's the one who always tells us, right? Just happy little accidents, right? He's there always watching me to make sure I don't get frustrated when things go wrong. All right, some more of the ultramarine blue and the cad yellow. I'm just getting some more of this going. I want it to be pretty dark. I want a nice dark version of this. Let me show you something that starts to happen. When you start to get really dark with your cad yellow and your ultramarine blue, you do get a dark green, but it's a little vivid, okay? It's a little on the blue side. It's a little on the chroma is a little bit too intense, whereas the green of the holly leaf, it's a warmer green. It's a more natural olivey kind of green. And this green, when you get dark, it's a little bit cooler. So to cool it down, just get a little bit of your sienna, and I mean just like a tiny little bit, okay? Because if you put too much, then you'll turn the whole thing brown. But I just put a little bit of sienna in there, and it just toned it down, got all of that cool out of there. And now it's more of this warmer tone of green. So I'm going to bring this almost up to that leaf. There's kind of like a little white highlight between those two leaf colors. And I'm also going to, on purpose, leave a little white streak right down the middle of this leaf to kind of be like a vein, to serve as a vein. All right, so the bottom portion of this leaf is dark, but then it gets really light back up toward the top. Sorry about that. We should all still be there. The phone calls, I turn them off and they still find me. I'm not sure. All right, so I just put all that dark green in there, but the top of the leaf is lighter, so I've just loaded up my brush. Didn't clean it out. I just loaded it up with a little bit of my yellow so that I can start to blend these two colors in together. Let one sort of push down on the other. This is just a wet brush that I'm using now to kind of do a little bit of blending. And I'm trying to be so careful to, just always add little undulation and tone and texture to the leaf so that it's not just this plain one solid color. And I can still, make some little vein marks if I want to. You don't want to overdo that. It's one of those things, it's kind of like it's a nice party trick, but you don't want to overdo it. I'm adding a good bit of sienna into a little bit of my green. I want to save some of that green, but I also want to get really dark over here. This is really a dark, sort of almost an olive tone of green, but I just want to drop it in here because that leaf gets so dark. And just keep looking back and forth at your photo too, and the shape of your leaf, and making sure that you're just getting those darks where they need to live. And so that leaf is a lot darker. Nice contrast between the leaf right behind it. Okay, I'm going to get into this leaf up here. Some more green. It's a little bit darker than all of these muted colors that are behind it. We just got so many different colors of green from just the yellow and the blue together. You can make so many colors. One of my things that, that I talk about a lot, especially in my workshops, is, minimalistic and simplifying. You want to keep things simple. I paint with probably, I've got 4 brushes with that I paint with in watercolor nearly exclusively. There might be another one that I use here and there, but for the most part I just use those same 4 just to keep it simple. And the same thing with my color palette. I just have a few colors. Even when if you take a workshop, you've probably done it before, and the instructor has you buy 17 colors and 5 different types of brushes that are different from what you already have. And sometimes I just don't think that's necessary. It's better to keep things simple, because they're definitely easier to repeat, and you really do get a lot of nice effects just using simple colors. And your paintings are typically a lot more cohesive, instead of having so many colors all over the place. Alright, so this leaf back here is a lot darker. I'm just adding, and you can see I have not paid attention to all the minute details. There's so many speckles and lines and different things inside each of these leaves, but I'm not really concerned about that. My main thing is to make sure that the values are there. Where it's dark, I want to make sure I'm dark. Where it's light, medium, I want to do the same. Value is so important. If you have been with me, or if you're in a workshop with me, you'll know that's what I talk about all the time. Value, value, value is so critical. I'm even going to bring some of that value over here. And then just a little bit back up here. This has dried even more. It's still a little bit damp, but I know that one leaf needs a little bit more value. So I'm just going to put it in there. But it's still damp a little bit on the edges so that it can still get soft and not stand out too much. So you see all of that soft green back here. It's back there, and we know that it's there. It's communicating to us shapes, but we don't have to get perfectly detailed with every little thing. I'm adding just a little bit of value right on the end of this leaf, and then just with water, I'm just going to pull that out. These little stems that are in the background, they're so pale, they're so light, and I know that they get a little bit darker as they come in toward where the berries are, but I don't want to do them that dark. I want to keep that value much lighter, because again, we talk about this a lot in my workshops. Photos can get away with communicating colors to you that your paintings cannot get away with. We need to keep these little stems back here need to stay really light, because if you make things in the background too dark, even though it might appear that way in a photo, if you make them too dark in your painting, then you've just invited your background to come along and take over the show, and is now competing with the things that are in the foreground, and so you don't want to do that. I'm just coming in here and adding a few these leaves do have these little undulating, curvy surfaces, and they sort of get some shadows on them. And this is one of those things where, when you've got time and you can sit down with it, you can really just sort of go crazy with it. You can kind of go whatever direction you would like. I'm going to come in here and add a little bit more of that yellow. Watercolor dries a little less vivid than when it goes down, so I wanted to come in here and just add a little bit more of that yellow color that I see happening in here in places. Alright, so now for the little fir evergreen stems that are coming out. To start in with this, I'm going to get rid of my salt. I've still got some that's sticking here. If this does need to be dry, okay, for you to take this away. And I didn't quite get enough texture on there. I'm going to add a little bit more here in just a second. I didn't quite get enough. I didn't go dark enough with that original gray, was what my problem was. Let me turn my attention to that, actually. If you have a little texture here, a little speckly texture down here, then you're good. You do not have to do this part. I didn't get my texture. I didn't get that dark enough. So I'm going to remedy that right here. So I'm going to wet this area just a little bit. And when you wet this area, if you're going to do it again, just make sure that you're using clean water, because your water is probably a little bit green right now. So you just want to make sure that that's clean water. All right, so back into that gray. So it was blue and a little bit of the sienna. And I think what I did earlier, I was trying to be so careful about it being thin that I went too far with it. It was too thin. All right, so when you put it in here, it's going to be a little bit darker than maybe seems appropriate. But when you put the salt in here, the salt does a good job at displacing all of that color. All right, so I'm going to let that sit for just a second. When you get something wet, that is the time to put some salt on it. But if it's too wet, the salt can actually just dissolve in your water, and then you get no effect. So I think that's about good right there. So now I'm going to come back in here and sprinkle my salt. And now I'm seeing my effect happen. Okay. All right, so let me hold this up. See how I just didn't get darker. Hey Cheryl, I know you keep having trouble with the sound, and let me know. I had sent you some information about how to adjust the internal settings on your MacBook to adjust for that sound. You can let me know if you had done that or not, because I think that you're the only one that's having trouble hearing me when I'm doing these things. So definitely want to get that straightened out, and I know we can get it resolved. So. All right, so here's what I'm going to do, ladies. This is really wet down here, but I need to work on these berries. So there's a little bit of moisture touching. I'm just going to dry this one little spot right here in the middle so that I can work on the berries. Okay, let me hold it up just so that everybody can kind of take a look at where we're at. So, you know, your colors, your shapes, everything are going to vary to some degree depending on what you've been doing. The main thing that I want to, hope is happening for you is that you've got lots of nice undulation of color, lots of nice variation of color, good contrasts happening where they need to. All of those little things really work together to bring your painting up to a higher level of sophistication when we've just used two colors, but we've created all of these wonderful shades of green with that. So, okay. All right, so this is still wet down here where the salt is and working, so I'm not going to disturb that. I'm just going to brush away any little salt grains that might be there so that I can focus on these little berries here. So when you get ready to do the berries, they do need to be dry. This area needs to be dry. Okay. All right, so I am going to use a small brush. This is the only brush that I absolutely, love for my students to have, because I use it so much, and then for you to be able to emulate some of the things that I'm doing, it's really hard to do without it. And this is a $5 brush, okay? So it's not like the kind, I've got some that are really expensive, but this one's definitely not going to break the bank. And I can't imagine being able to complete most of my paintings without this brush. All right, so I had asked for, I think I had asked everybody to have some kind of red for the berries, so whatever red you have. You might have alizarin crimson, you might have cadmium red, you might, I'm not sure exactly what you have, so I want you to just, kind of mix up a red that you like. The red that I'm using Winsor red, which is a Winsor Newton color, and it is a very intense, cool red, very, very vivid. It's a little bit too vivid for the berries, so I'm going to put a little bit of my sienna into it to just tone it down, warm it up a little bit, so that it really gets into that holly berry color. And that holly berry is sort of it's almost an orangey type of red. It's just got such a nice tone. So you can see how I went from sort of a pinkish purplish, a pinkish red, down to this warmer red. Okay, all right, so I've got that mixed up. All right, I am going to be careful on my little holly berries to leave a little highlight up at the top of just dry white paper. So I'm actually going to wet the whole berry, and if you want to watch me just do one, and then I'll hold it up so that you can see exactly where I painted water, I'll let you do that. Let me just show you what I've got here. I'm getting the whole berry wet with just a little bit of water, but I'm leaving a little tiny slit shape of white paper that's dry. All right, let me see if I can, let's see, get the glare just right. Oh dear, let's see. It's so small. Oh, I can't do it. Hold on. Let me see if maybe I don't have enough water. I think I'll try putting actually more water than what I need to paint with, but it'll let you see it. Oh my goodness. This usually works so well, but it's just so tiny. There we go. I'm starting to see it. Okay, there we go. All right, so you see how I've got the berry wet, but I left this little, kind of looks like a little upside down smiley, like a little frown shape, okay? And I've left that just white paper, dry. Okay, that's going to be my highlight later, okay? All right, so I got that a little wetter than I needed to, just so that you could see it. So I'm going to use my brush to kind of drink up some of that. So I'm just going to get into my red, and I'm just going to drop it in there. And when I drop it, make sure you're dropping it right wherever it was wet, and it'll just kind of take off and follow that water. And we haven't done a shadow yet. Don't worry about the shadow. We're just trying to get that main color of red in there right now. And you can see how important it is to have a tiny brush for things like this. It's just so critical. All right, so there's one. All right, so I'm just going to go through and do that on all the others. And, and I'll mix it up a little bit. Some of the shapes might be a little bit different, because I don't want it to look like they all are just perfectly matchy-matchy with that same little upside-down shape. Some of them might just have a dot at the top. You want to mix it up a little bit. But just get it wet and then drop the paint in there. See, that one's shaped a little bit differently. Just want to mix it up. Alright, so I'm just going to keep moving through here. Now there's two berries that are like super side by side, And so what I'll do, I'll just kind of skip over that little guy for a second and then go to the next one. Now this little berry over here on the far right, it does have some shadow on the top of it because of the way that it's positioned, kind of tucked up under a leaf. So I'm going to try to copy that same light pattern, you know, so the little highlight will be on a different position. Dropping that red. And see that one even, I kind of closed it up a little bit. It's got two little specks of white. So just, you know, you just want to mix it up a little bit. So that they're not, so that they don't look like these little overly matched little things. And these are really small, so you want to control the amount of water. What can happen is that you might have a big, like a blister of water, you know, sitting on the paper, and then you touch it with your paint, and then the paint just swims around inside. In fact, let me show you what it can look like. If you don't have a real tiny brush, this is what can happen. You get your water in there, and then you add your paint, and then the paint just sort of swims around in there. Looks like this, you know, the color streaks inside of a marble, you know, just because you've got way too much water sitting there to the point that it makes a little bubble coming up. And when you do that, the paint is just going to be suspended in the little bubble of water, and it never even makes contact with the paper. And it has to make contact with the paper, or you can't see the pigment. Otherwise, it's just sort of floating in that weird space. All right, more little berries. I gotta mix up a little bit more red. It was more paint than I thought I was gonna need. And then, you know, as you go, if you see a little spot where you think you need a little bit more, just put it in there. Now these two little berries kind of touch a little bit, and that's okay. And the colors, they're going to mingle a little bit, and that's fine too. There's still that little, there's kind of a little berry back in here now that I see it, and one here. Alright, so I'm getting my little berries in there. Alright, now the little stems that are happening, I'm going to do that color by just taking some of my burnt sienna, and I'm going to mix it with a little bit of my blue, but this time I'm keeping it more on the brown side, okay? So I started with my sienna. See, I've got a nice brown sort of tone. And I'm going to start right in the middle where all of these little stems sort of make a cluster of dark brown right here in the middle. And then I'll just bring it out and let it contact each one of these little berries, and you see when it touches the berries, that brown will kind of race off into the little berry, giving it a little shadow for free. We didn't even really have to paint that. See how it just takes off right in there. And then I'm adding a little bit extra brown in some of these spots just to mix it up a little bit. And some of these browns even go up into the leaf that's there. Alright, one of these, it gets really dark right in the center. So in that brown mixture, I just added a little bit more blue to darken it. See, I can just drop that in there. I'll do another one. See there how all those colors run together they just give you the shadows that you need. And you didn't have to really paint them. So that's one of the great things about those colors, letting them sort of run together. Don't be afraid to let them run together because they can really work with you to give you exactly what you need. All right, so right at this stage, let me make sure nobody has a question. Okay, we're good on that. Okay, I don't think anybody had a question. All right, so at this point, all of this needs to be dried, and then we're going to do the little evergreen things, and then we're going to be done with this one. So let's get this dry. Okay, all right, so this is dry. I'm getting the salt out of the way. And you guys will have to tell me. I've got like this brand new mosquito bite on my hand, and it had to have happened when I was painting just now, but I didn't know it. So somebody will have to tell me. Did you see a mosquito biting my hand? That lets you know how warm it is in Georgia. It's almost Halloween, but we still have mosquitoes. Yay! Okay. All right. So. Just getting all the salt, getting my tape pressed back down. All right, so check out the little texture at the bottom. See how it gave us just a little interesting texture down there that kind of mimics what was going on in that in our photo. All right, so let's take care of our little strands here. So this is going to happen in a couple of stages. I am going to use my little dagger brush to paint the needles when I get to that point. But first, I'm going to start by wetting this area, and I'm going to kind of draw a little bit with the water. You know, I'm going to kind of sort of mimic these little needles coming out just a little. I'm not going for the exact shape completely. I just want to get this area wet in a way that it basically captures the shape of that. And then I'm going to take some of my green, get this mixed back up a little bit. Now the evergreens, it doesn't really show in this photo because I think these are probably like fake. I don't know, maybe I don't know if they're fake or not, but those evergreen branches are a little bit bluer. You know, the green is a little bit bluer. So for my taste anyway, I was going to make these just a little bit bluer so that they kind of offset from that warm green of the holly. So I'm going to come in here and just sort of drop that in here, and I'm just sort of filling this area with a little bit of color, and you can see where I had drawn a few little lines. The paint is just chasing off into all those areas where I let the paint come earlier. And this is not really my my little stem. I'm just kind of I'm prepping this area. This is like a background or a base coat for each of these. I'm going to do the same thing for all of these. And this color is really, it gets almost yellow. Back over here on this end, just dropped a little bit of yellow in there. Just going to push some of that in there. Just this tiny little bit of brighter yellow sort of color happening in there. And again, you see, I'm not obsessing over what are the shapes back there. There's some sort of greenish, yellowish color back there, and so I'm just going to put that too. You know, I'm not really focused on the shapes. And we're actually going to make the little needles in a little bit, but I'm almost making, it's like a little pad of color for each of these to rest on. Kind of anchors them so they don't look like they're weird and floating out here. The same thing for this one, it sort of just extends off. And it's a real light color, you know, I'm not going real dark here. I'm going to save that for when I start working with the needles, because they are a good bit darker. All right, so you can see that area that I have done. It's really soft, and this is meant to be just sort of like a base for each of these little branches to kind of rest on, a base of color for them to rest on. So for me to continue, let me just dry that right quick because I need that to be dry. Okay. All right, it'll become clear in just a second why I did that. You know, when we have more time, you know, when I'm teaching an actual class, I get into the why and all that kind of stuff of why it's important to have that there, but we'll kind of truck along here just a little bit. You can already see though, see how we use the dark color for these little stems in here, but we didn't use it out here, even though it exists in the photo. But if we had, you can imagine if we had dark stems out here, that would be very distracting from this nice little area right here. And we don't want to do that. We want to keep this the star of the show, okay? And you know, the camera can get away with, you know, adding details in places where we don't really need them, and adding values in places where we don't need them. All right, so I'm going to mix up some green, a little bit darker than what I've got here, because I want to get darker than this. So again, it's just my ultramarine and my yellow, and I just want to make sure that it's darker than this. And then I'm going to come in here. Now is when I'm going to actually start working on painting some of these needles. So the needles nest in pretty well right up under these little berries. And I'm going to just start. See, this one we didn't bother with drawing all these because you're going to come right back in here with your brush and, you know, start painting these things. And it'll start to become apparent why we're using that little base coat. It automatically adds definition, okay, to those little branch shapes. You can imagine if I'd come in here just on light paper and just started making these strokes, it wouldn't give us the same dimensional impact if we hadn't put that little shadow tone underneath, okay? So that's the reason we build up those types of layers, so that we make sure that we're communicating visually what's there without making too many strokes or too few, okay? You want to try to communicate your image in just the right amount of brush strokes. You don't want to overdo it, and it can be real easy to overdo it, especially with little you know, needles like this, because the idea is to, you just want to come in here and just make mark after mark, but try to be a little bit more intentional. And I do notice that the color of these lightens a good bit as I start to move to the foreground, which makes sense. And they're also a little bit blurry. So I'm keeping them nice and loose. And then in fact right here in the foreground, I may just blur them completely by obscuring with just some water. All right, now I'm going to turn my attention over to this side, and I can see the little some of these come right out. And you can see how much dimensional quality is added just because we put that little shadow of tone right behind. And make sure you're leaving little gaps and spaces, because some of these they don't all overlap. And as it goes back into the, as it goes back away from us a little bit, there is some texture back here, but it's Again, it's just kind of these strange little textural shapes. I'm not going to go too heavy with it. Now I'm going to get into a little bit of just a little bit of the sienna and mix it with some of this green to get a really dark kind of olive green, just because I want to use it to kind of drop it in a couple of places to sort of indicate where there might be a stem from the, from the little branch showing up. And it kind of looks like it might need a little bit of shadow up under each of these little berries. Just a little, kind of helped. I'm even going to darken this little area right here in the center just a little bit. Those little stems are a little bit darker. And if you felt like your berries got if they got brownish or something, you can come back in here with a little red glaze and give them a little pop. Just protect your little highlights that you worked so hard on. You don't want to get those covered up. And then we're just about done here. Okay. All right. I see one little thing that I'm going to fiddle with. There's a little bit of darker value right over here that leaf could use. I'm just going to soften that with some water. Soften that out. There we go. There is a little bit of that stem that comes right off the back here that I'm going to put just on the other side of that. What that's doing, it felt like to me that the colors were, this brown had just kind of stopped too abruptly, and I needed to see a little bit of, just a tiny little bit, continue out on the other side of the berries. But then I've let it just really softly, don't take that brown all the way up into these, even though I know in the photo it does. Just leave it nice and soft, and I think we have it. Let me dry this and take the tape away. All right. So let me take the tape away here, nice and dry. There we go. Awesome. All right, so a very cute little card. Let me turn this around so it's a little bit cleaner and easier to look at. But such a cute little painting, okay? And so we worked on that. I talked for a little bit in the beginning, but I would say that it took us an hour to do that, okay? And that part of that was me kind of redoing a little section down here that I didn't like. But it makes such a nice little soft painting, okay?